The morning Georgia Aldridge walked into the wrong church. She was wearing the most beautiful dress anyone in Redemption Creek, Texas had ever seen, and she was about to make the worst mistake of her 23 years on Earth. It was the spring of 1882, and the Texas Panhandle had been blooming in that rare, defiant way it sometimes did after a long winter, wildflowers pushing through cracked red earth, cottonwood trees shaking loose their white tufts into a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Georgia had traveled 4 days by stagecoach from San Antonio, and before that, 2 days by train from her hometown of Galveston, all to marry a man she had met exactly twice. His name was Clement Fairfax, and he was the second son of a cattle baron, and he had written her letters that were formal and polished and entirely devoid of warmth, which she had chosen to interpret as dignity rather than coldness, because the alternative meant admitting that she had agreed to this arrangement for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with desperation. Georgia's father, Thomas Aldridge, had died the previous autumn, leaving behind a hardware store that had been quietly drowning in debt for years, a house with a leaking roof, and a younger sister named Bess who was 17 and needed looking after. Georgia had sold the hardware store to cover most of the debts and found herself standing at the edge of a cliff with no good options in sight. She was educated, she was capable, she could sew and cook and keep accounts, but the world of 1882 did not particularly care about what a woman could do. What it cared about was who she belonged to. Clement Fairfax had been introduced to her at a church social by a mutual acquaintance, and he had seemed respectable enough, and he had proposed in writing 2 weeks later with the sort of efficiency that suggested he had approached the whole matter the way he might approach purchasing livestock. Georgia had written back with her acceptance, told herself it was practical and sensible, and spent 3 months quietly mourning the life she had imagined for herself before packing it away in a trunk along with her mother's pearls and her father's pocket watch. The dress had been her mother's. Eleanor Aldridge had been a seamstress of considerable talent, and the wedding gown she had made for herself in 1856 was a masterpiece of ivory silk and hand-tatted lace, with a bodice fitted close and a skirt that fell in soft, heavy waves to the floor. Georgia had taken it in slightly at the waist and let out the hem, and when she put it on the morning of her wedding, even she had to admit she looked like something out of a painting. Bess had cried. Their landlady had pressed a wildflower into Georgia's hair. The stagecoach driver had tipped his hat without being asked. Redemption Creek was a small town, the kind that existed in honest relationship with the land around it. A single main street of weathered buildings, a livery stable, a general store, a saloon with a faded painted sign, a sheriff's office with a crooked star nailed above the door, and 2 churches. 2 churches, which was the detail Georgia had failed to account for when she climbed down from the stagecoach in the heat of a May morning, dress carefully bundled in her arms, and asked the first person she saw where the wedding was being held. That person was a young boy of perhaps 10 who pointed down the street and said, "That big white one at the end, ma'am." And Georgia had thanked him and walked in that direction without thinking to ask which big white one at which end, because the street curved slightly and there were, as it turned out, 2 white churches, one belonging to the Methodist congregation and one belonging to the Baptists, positioned at opposite ends of Redemption Creek's main thoroughfare like bookends holding the whole town together. The Methodist church was the one at the south end. Georgia walked into the Baptist church at the north end, where a wedding was also in progress, which she discovered only after she had pushed open the door and walked halfway down the aisle before the faces of the assembled guests made her slow her steps and finally stop. The church was fuller than she'd expected. Roughly 40 people turned to look at her with expressions ranging from confusion to delight to something approaching alarm. The preacher at the front, a barrel-chested man with white mutton-chop sideburns and a face like a sun-weathered Bible, had his mouth open mid-sentence. At the altar stood a man Georgia had never seen before in her life, tall, sandy-haired, wearing a suit that clearly belonged to someone else based on the way it pulled across his shoulders, and beside him, a woman in a yellow dress who was staring at Georgia with an expression of absolute bewilderment. Georgia stopped walking. The silence in the church was total except for the sound of a horsefly batting against one of the high windows. "Oh," said Georgia. "Oh," said the woman in the yellow dress. Said Georgia, and then stopped, because there were genuinely no words that adequately covered this situation. It was at this precise moment that someone in the back of the church stood up. He had been seated at the very end of the last pew, which was why Georgia had not seen him when she walked in. He had been half hidden by the shadow of a support beam and the broad back of a woman in a green bonnet. He rose to his feet slowly but with complete deliberateness, the way a man stands when he has made a decision and is comfortable with it. He was tall, genuinely tall, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had clearly not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days. He was wearing work clothes rather than Sunday clothes, a dark canvas shirt, dark trousers, worn boots, which suggested he had either come directly from somewhere else or simply did not own a suit. He had a hat in his hands held by the brim, and he was turning it slowly as he looked at Georgia with an expression she could not immediately read. The preacher looked at him. "Mr. Abbott," he said, with the tone of a man who is trying to ascertain whether he is about to have a problem. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," said the man, and his voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned not to rush because the land around it moved slowly. "I believe this lady might have gotten the wrong building." Georgia, who had not moved, felt something strange happen in her chest, a loosening, as though a knot she had not known was there had suddenly slipped free. She looked at him. He looked at her. 40 people swiveled between them like spectators at a tennis match they had not expected to see. "The Methodist Church is at the other end of the street, ma'am," the man said. "I'd be happy to show you the way if you like." His name, as the preacher had already told her, was Wallace Abbott. She would not forget it. Georgia became aware that she was standing in the middle of a Baptist wedding in a dress that cost more than most men in Redemption Creek earned in a year, with a wildflower in her hair and a small travel bag dangling from her wrist, and that the entire town was watching her. She turned slightly to the assembled congregation and said, with as much dignity as she could assemble, "I am so terribly sorry for the interruption. Please carry on." And then she turned back toward the door and walked out of the church the way she had come in, which was to say with her back straight and her steps measured, because Eleanor Aldridge had raised her daughter to exit a situation the same way she entered it. She was standing on the church steps, pressing one hand flat against her collarbone and breathing carefully, when she heard the door open behind her. Wallace Abbott stepped out into the May sunlight and settled his hat onto his head and looked at her with a kind of calm attention that she found, unexpectedly, more steadying than sympathy would have been. "That was gracefully handled," he said. "It was a disaster," said Georgia. "Yes," he agreed, "but a graceful one." She looked at him. Up close he was perhaps 27 or 28, with gray-green eyes that sat slightly deeper than most people's, as though they were used to looking at things from a distance and had adapted accordingly. There was a scar along his left jawline, thin and old, and his hands around his hat brim were the hands of a man who worked outdoors. "You came out here to show me to the correct church," Georgia said. "I did," he said. "You missed the rest of the ceremony." "I wasn't going to enjoy it much anyway," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested a longer story, but he did not offer it and she did not ask. "I'm Georgia Aldridge," she said. "Wallace Abbott," he said. "I know who you're here to marry." She felt something shift slightly, like a door opening onto a view she had not anticipated. "You know Clement Fairfax." "I know of him," Wallace said, with a carefulness that she filed away. "Everybody in Redemption Creek knows of the Fairfax family." The way he said it was not flattering, and Georgia heard that clearly, but she had agreed to this marriage, and she was standing in the dress and the stagecoach was already gone, so she lifted her chin and said, Would you mind walking me to the right church? I'd rather not be any later than I already am." "Of course," said Wallace Abbott, and he offered her his arm with a naturalness that made her take it without thinking. They walked down the main street of Redemption Creek together, Georgia in her ivory silk and her mother's lace, Wallace in his canvas work shirt, and the whole town seemed to pause around them the way things pause when something is happening that cannot quite be named yet. "Have you been in town long?" Georgia asked, because the silence between them was the kind that felt like it needed some management. "Born here," said Wallace. "Well, 6 miles east of here. My family runs cattle, about 300 head now, down from more before the winter of '78 hit." "That was a terrible winter," Georgia said. She remembered reading about it in the Galveston papers, the freeze that had devastated cattle herds across the Panhandle. "It was," he said. "We lost 2/3 of the herd. It's taken 4 years to rebuild." He said it without self-pity, just as plain fact, and she respected that. "And you're not a church-going man usually," she said. "Or you'd have been better dressed." He glanced at her sideways, and there was the beginning of something in his expression, not quite a smile, something earlier than a smile. "My neighbor's wedding. I respected her enough to show up. I didn't respect the groom enough to put on a borrowed coat." Georgia filed that away too. She was filing a great deal about Wallace Abbott, which she recognized as pointless given what she was walking toward, but she found she could not help it. They arrived at the Methodist church, which was, indeed, at the other end of the street, and was smaller and plainer, and Georgia could see through the open door, considerably less full. A handful of people stood or sat inside, some of the Fairfax family's ranch hands from the look of them, a few townspeople, and at the altar stood Reverend Horace Marsh, who was thin and tall and young for a preacher, with an anxious look that deepened considerably when he saw Georgia arrive on the arm of a man he did not recognize. And there, beside the altar, was Clement Fairfax. Georgia had met him twice, as she'd told herself, but in the sharp light of a May morning it was striking how much less she remembered about him than the letters had implied. He was 32, dark-haired, with a lean face and careful eyes, and he was looking at Georgia not with relief or warmth, but with the particular expression of a man who has noticed something unexpected and is calculating whether it affects his arrangements. His eyes moved to Wallace Abbott's arm, which Georgia was still holding because she had not let go, and then to Wallace Abbott's face, and something moved behind his careful eyes that was not quite jealousy, more like a landlord noticing an unauthorized presence on his property. "Miss Aldridge," Clement said. "Mr. Fairfax," Georgia said, and she released Wallace's arm and felt the cold of losing that warmth immediately. "I apologize for my lateness. I went to the wrong church." "So I heard," Clement said, and the speed of this suggested someone had already sent word, which meant the whole of Redemption Creek had already heard about it, which was the nature of small towns everywhere. He looked again at Wallace. Wallace held his gaze with the calm steadiness of a man who was not going to be the first to look away. "Abbott," Clement said finally. "Fairfax," said Wallace. Between those two words, Georgia felt the entire history of whatever existed between them, and it was not warm, and it was not small. "I'll leave you to it," Wallace said, addressing Georgia rather than Clement, and he touched the brim of his hat, not a dismissal, more like a seal on something, and turned and walked back up the main street of Redemption Creek without hurrying. Georgia watched him go for perhaps a second longer than was sensible, and then she turned to face the altar. The ceremony proceeded. Reverend Marsh spoke the words with the practiced steadiness of a young man who had performed this service enough times to make it automatic, and Georgia listened and responded at the appropriate moments, and Clement placed a ring on her finger that was gold and tasteful and utterly impersonal, and when Reverend Marsh said she could be kissed, Clement pressed his lips against her cheek with the brief efficiency of a man who had other things to get back to. It was done. Georgia Fairfax stood in the Methodist Church of Redemption Creek, Texas on the 12th of May, 1882, wearing her dead mother's dress, and told herself that this was a practical solution to a practical problem, and that warmth could come later, and that she had made a promise. She was not sure she believed any of these things entirely. The reception was held at the Fairfax Ranch, which was 7 miles outside of town and considerably more impressive than Georgia had expected. A large ranch house built of good timber, a long porch, several outbuildings, and a cookhouse that smelled of roasting beef. The Fairfax family patriarch, Harlan Fairfax, was a man of 60 with white hair and a politician's handshake, and he welcomed Georgia with the effusive warmth of a man who had acquired something he wanted and was pleased with the acquisition. "Fine-looking woman," Harlan said to his son, right in front of Georgia as though she could not hear him. "The photograph didn't do you justice, my dear." "Thank you," said Georgia, who was becoming increasingly familiar with being assessed. Clement's mother, Margaret Fairfax, was a thin, precise woman who examined Georgia's dress with the appraising eye of someone who knew exactly what it cost and was calculating what that said about the Aldridge family's finances. She shook Georgia's hand briefly and said, "You'll want to change out of that before dinner," which was not welcoming but was at least direct. Georgia changed out of her mother's dress alone in the room that was now her bedroom, folding the silk carefully and laying it in the trunk she had brought from Galveston, and she pressed her hands flat against the fabric for a moment before she closed the lid, and she did not cry, because she had made a decision, and crying over it would not unmake it. The first week of her marriage was instructive in the way that cold water is instructive. It communicated a great deal very quickly. Clement was not cruel. He was not violent. He was simply absent-present in the physical sense most of the time, away from the ranch on business the rest of it, but never really there in the ways that Georgia had hoped for, and had told herself not to expect. He spoke to her when necessary, acknowledged her competence in running the household with a nod, and seemed to regard her as a satisfactory arrangement rather than a person. She threw herself into the work of the ranch house because work was something she was good at, and because idle hands in her experience led to excessive introspection. She reorganized the kitchen with the cook, a sturdy Mexican woman named Consuela, who regarded her new mistress with initial suspicion and gradually warming approval. She learned the accounts that Harlan Fairfax had been keeping sloppily for years and quietly brought them into order. She wrote long letters to Bess in Galveston, who had found a position as a schoolteacher's assistant and was making ends meet with a cheerfulness that Georgia found both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. In the third week of her residence at the Fairfax Ranch, she rode out alone on a bay mare named Copper, who was the gentlest horse in the remuda, because she needed air and space and movement, and because the walls of the ranch house had begun to feel like they were very slowly contracting. She had been riding for perhaps an hour, out across the flat grassland to the east where the land rolled gently, and the creek that gave the town its name ran shallow and clear over red stones, when she came over a small rise and saw a man crouching beside the creek bank, running his hand through the water. He stood when he heard her horse. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting, and when he turned she recognized him immediately. Wallace Abbott looked at her with an expression of calm surprise that settled quickly into something else, something that took her a moment to identify as genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Fairfax," he said, and the name sounded strange coming from him, like a word in a foreign language said aloud for the first time. "Miss Aldridge," she said before she could stop herself, and then felt the color rise in her face because that was not her name anymore and they both knew it. "I mean, I apologize, Georgia." "Georgia," he said, and he said it simply, without making anything of it, which was somehow worse than if he had. "What are you doing down here?" she asked. "This creek runs across the corner of my property before it hits the Fairfax land," he said. "I was checking the flow. It's been lower than usual this spring." He looked at the water for a moment. "Somebody upstream dammed part of it last fall, still working out whether it was deliberate." "Is there much of that?" Georgia asked. "Disputes over water." "Out here there's disputes over everything," Wallace said. Water, land, grazing rights, fence lines. The Fairfax family has had more than their share of disputes with every ranch within 20 miles. He stopped and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that seemed to always be measuring some distance. I probably shouldn't say that to you. Probably not, Georgia agreed. But I appreciate honesty. He was quiet for a moment, and the creek ran over its stones, and a meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass. "How are you settling in?" he asked, and the question was careful but genuine. Georgia opened her mouth to say fine, which was the word she had been using with everyone, and instead she said, "It's a very large house." Wallace looked at her steadily. "And quiet," she added. "I imagine it might be," he said, with a restraint that told her he was holding back considerably more than he was saying. "You and Mr. Fairfax," Georgia said, "you know each other in some way that is not friendly." Wallace turned his hat in his hands. She had noticed he did this when he was thinking. "We grew up in the same county," he said. "That's not the same as knowing each other." "But something happened," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "My father had 120 acres along the north fence of the Fairfax property," he said. "Good land, good water. In the winter of '78, when we lost most of our cattle, my father went to Harlan Fairfax and asked for a short loan to see us through. They'd been neighbors for 25 years. He paused. Harlan offered him a third of what the land was worth as a buyout instead. Georgia was very still. My father took it, Wallace said. He didn't have a choice. He died the following spring. I've been buying back land acre by acre since then." He looked at the creek again. "I own the 60 acres along this creek now. I got there eventually, but those 25 years of being a good neighbor didn't count for much when it came to it." Georgia thought about the way Harlan Fairfax had shaken her hand with such warmth at the reception, about the way Clement had moved through the world with the easy confidence of a man who had never had to count the cost of anything. She thought about what it must have felt like to be 23 or 24 years old, watching your father accept a bad deal because a man he had trusted held all the cards. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was unjust." "Yes," said Wallace simply. "It was." They stood there for a moment in the May sunshine on opposite sides of a small creek that ran across the boundary of their respective lives, and Georgia felt the specific ache of a thing she could not name precisely. "I should get back," she said. "Of course," he said. "I'm sorry for," she began, meaning the whole of everything, the wedding and the church and the Fairfax name she now carried and all of it. "Don't be," he said. "None of it's your doing." She rode back to the Fairfax ranch, and she did not look back. But she thought about him for the rest of that day, with the particular guilty attention you give to things you know you should not be thinking about. She saw him again 2 weeks later at the general store in town, where she had gone to purchase thread and writing paper. He was at the counter buying fence wire, and he turned when she came in and nodded at her with a formality that she understood was necessary and correct, and they spoke briefly about nothing. The weather, the price of beef, whether the new saddler on the end of the street was any good, and when she left she felt as though the sun outside was brighter than it had been when she went in. She saw him the week after that at Sunday services at the Methodist church, which surprised her until she remembered that he had come to his neighbor's wedding out of respect, and perhaps this was the same principle. He sat 3 rows behind her and Clement, and she was careful not to turn around more than once, and even once was too many, because Clement noticed and said nothing, but she could feel his silence as a judgment. The summer arrived with the full force that Texas summers deploy, and the ranch became a place of long, blinding days and nights that held their heat past midnight. Georgia had been corresponding with Bess about her salary as a schoolteacher's assistant. It was less than they had hoped, and Georgia had been quietly worried, and she had finally raised it with Clement in the careful, practical way she discussed household matters with him, presenting it as a simple arithmetic problem rather than a request. Clement had looked at her across the dinner table with those careful eyes and said, "Your sister is not my responsibility." Georgia had said nothing. She had waited until the next morning and written to Bess with instructions to sell the last of their father's books, which was not what she wanted to do, but which was what was available. She had a small personal allowance from Clement, which she had been saving carefully, and she transferred most of it to Bess that month. In August, Clement went to Dallas on business and was gone for 10 days. He left at first light on a Monday, and Georgia stood on the porch and watched the dust of his horse recede and felt something that was not grief. That afternoon she walked down to the creek. She told herself she was walking because of the heat and because the creek was the only shade on that side of the property. She told herself she was not going there because she knew there was a chance Wallace Abbott might be there, working his land or checking the water levels, or simply existing in that quiet, steady way he seemed to inhabit the world. He was there. He was mending a section of fence along the creek bank, working with the economical movements of someone who has done a job so many times it has become a form of thinking. He heard her coming and straightened, and when he saw it was her, his expression went through several things very quickly and settled on careful. "Mr. Fairfax is away," Georgia said, because she thought it was better to say it plainly. "I know," Wallace said. "I saw him go this morning." A beat of silence. "I was going to walk along the creek," Georgia said. "It's your land," Wallace said. "It's the Fairfax land," she corrected, and the distinction felt like pressing a bruise. He watched her for a moment. Then he set down his fence tool and said, "I'll walk with you a ways if that's agreeable. I need to check the water flow past the old willow." It was agreeable. It was more than agreeable, which was precisely the problem. They walked along the creek bank in the August heat, and the cottonwood trees threw shade over the water, and Georgia talked about Galveston and about her father's hardware store and about Bess, and Wallace listened with the kind of attention that is rarer than people understand, the kind that doesn't wait for its own turn to speak. He talked about his cattle, about the land he was slowly rebuilding, about a horse he was breaking that was the most stubborn creature he had encountered in 27 years of dealing with stubborn creatures. 27, Georgia said. "You're 27. This September," he said. "I'm 23, she said. "I know," he said, and then stopped as though he'd said something he hadn't intended to. "How?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "You came up in conversation once or twice before you arrived. The Fairfax family discussed the arrangement with enough people in town that everyone knew the broad details." Georgia thought about that being discussed by strangers before she even arrived, her age and her family's finances laid out for judgment by people she'd never met. The injustice of it sat heavy. A woman's life arranged like a land transaction, her particulars circulated like livestock specifications. She had known it when she agreed to it, but knowing something and feeling it were different animals entirely. And what did people think, she asked. Wallace was quiet for a moment. "Some thought it was a good arrangement for both parties," he said carefully. "And others," he looked at the water, "others thought Clement Fairfax didn't deserve the good fortune of a woman like you." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her, and the light through the cottonwood leaves was moving and dappled, and the creek made its small sound over the stones. And Georgia Aldridge, who was Georgia Fairfax now on paper, though she still sometimes forgot, looked at Wallace Abbott and felt the ground beneath her shift in a way that had nothing to do with the Texas soil. "You should not say things like that to me," she said, and her voice was steady because she made it so. "No," he agreed. "I should not." "I am married," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you are a good man," she said, "and good men do not put women in impossible positions." He held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed across his face that was too honest to look at directly. "No," he said. "They don't." He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. "I won't say it again." She nodded, and they walked back in a silence that was full rather than empty, and when they parted at the fence line she said, "Thank you for the walk," and he said, "Any time," and they both understood that any time could not and should not be often. But she thought about what he had said for the rest of August and into September, and she thought about the way he had listened when she talked about her father, and the way he had said her name that first day in the Methodist Church, Georgia, as though it were something worth saying carefully. The trouble with Clement did not come all at once. It arrived the way erosion does, gradually and then suddenly. In the fall, she found out from Consuela, who heard everything, as good cooks always do, that Clement kept a room in the hotel in town during his business trips, and that the business trips happened to coincide with the visits of a widow named Clara Bellamy, who had come to Redemption Creek from Fort Worth, and who was rumored to be both beautiful and entirely uninterested in propriety. Georgia sat with this information for 3 days before she felt the full shape of it. And then she sat with it for 3 more days, during which she was quieter than usual, and Clement seemed to notice the quiet and interpret it as one of the general inconveniences of having a wife. On the 7th day, she asked him directly over breakfast, with Consuela conveniently in the cookhouse and Harlan and Margaret Fairfax out on the property. She asked him calmly and without drama, because she was not a dramatic woman by nature, and because she thought he deserved the dignity of being asked plainly. He did not deny it. He looked at her across the breakfast table and said, with a composure that she would have found admirable in any other context, "Clara Bellamy is a private matter." Georgia set down her coffee cup. "I am your wife," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you are an excellent one. The house is well run, the accounts are in better order than they've been in years, and you present well in company. I have no complaints." Georgia felt a cold that had nothing to do with the October morning seep through her. "That," she said carefully, "is not what a wife is." Clement looked at her with those calculating eyes. "What did you expect when you agreed to this?" he said, and his voice was not cruel, only direct, which was almost worse. "You needed security. I needed a competent woman to run my household and stand beside me at public occasions. We both knew what this was." She had known. She had told herself she had known. But knowing something in the abstract, before it had a name like Clara Bellamy, was different from knowing it with the full weight of reality attached. She pushed back her chair and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and this time she did cry, briefly and efficiently. And then she washed her face and went back downstairs and continued the day, because there was no alternative, and because her sister still needed the money, and because leaving was not a thing that women in her position simply did. But something had changed. Something had cracked, and the cold air that came through the crack was clarifying. November came with its bite, and the range was brown and dry, and the cattle moved slow across the flat land. Georgia had taken to riding out in the late afternoons, which was not remarked upon by Clement because he was frequently not home at that hour, and on 2 occasions in November she met Wallace at the fence line, once by coincidence, and once, she admitted to herself, by something less innocent. They talked. They always talked carefully, and they stayed on the right side of every line, but the lines were becoming increasingly clear, and that made them increasingly difficult to ignore. He told her about his plans for the spring. He wanted to run 100 more head, and he had been in correspondence with a cattle broker in Abilene about quality breeding stock. She told him about Bess's letters, which had become increasingly cheerful, and about the boy Bess had mentioned 3 times in 3 different letters in ways that she tried to make sound casual. "Your sister is in love," Wallace observed. "She is 23 letters deep into it," Georgia agreed, "and doesn't know she's showing." He laughed at that, a real laugh, low and genuine, the first time she had heard it, and it undid something in her chest that she had been keeping very carefully assembled. She rode home in the November dark and pressed her hand against her sternum and told herself, very sternly, to stop. In December, Bess came to visit. This had been arranged in advance, a Christmas visit, and Georgia had been looking forward to it with an intensity that told her how much she needed someone she could talk to honestly. Bess arrived on the stagecoach from San Antonio looking pink-cheeked and bright-eyed and carrying a carpet bag that was considerably lighter than the circumstances warranted, and she threw her arms around Georgia on the main street of Redemption Creek and held on for a long moment. "You look thin," Bess said. "I look the same," Georgia said. "You look thin and tired and like you've been being very sensible," Bess said, which was an accusation dressed as concern. "Hush," said Georgia, and took her bag. Bess spent 2 weeks at the Fairfax ranch. She was charming with Harlan and Margaret, who approved of her immediately, and she was polite and distant with Clement, who she had decided upon in approximately 20 minutes and said nothing about except to raise her eyebrows at Georgia behind his back. She and Consuela became allies within a day. She rode copper in the afternoons and proclaimed Texas ridiculous in its flatness, but beautiful. On the fourth day of her visit, Bess came back from a ride and found Georgia in the sitting room and sat across from her and said, "Who is Wallace Abbott?" Georgia looked up from her sewing. "How do you know that name?" Consuela mentioned him. She mentioned him while describing the creek and the fence line and how his cattle are very well kept for a man working without a ranch crew of any size. Bess's eyes were very direct, and then she stopped talking and looked at me sideways. Georgia set down her sewing. "He is a neighboring rancher," she said, and said Bess. "And nothing," said Georgia, "he is a good man. He is honest and hardworking, and he showed me the way to the Methodist church on my wedding day when I walked into the wrong one." Bess stared at her. "You walked into the wrong church on your wedding day." Georgia had not mentioned this in her letters. She had not mentioned it to anyone. "It was a very minor incident," she said. "You walked into the wrong church in that dress," Bess said slowly, "and a cowboy stood up and helped you, and now he is the neighbor you ride to the fence line to talk to." "I do not specifically ride to the fence line to," Georgia began. "Georgia," said Bess, with the simple firmness of a younger sister who has run out of patience for her elder's diplomacy. Georgia was quiet. "He is married to someone else," Bess said, and then stopped, corrected herself. "No, wait, you are married to someone else." "Yes," said Georgia, "and he is not married," Georgia said, and hated herself slightly for having that information ready. Bess looked at her for a long time. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," said Georgia. "I am going to do nothing because I am a married woman and I made a commitment, and that is the end of it." Bess pressed her lips together. "What does he think?" "It doesn't matter," Georgia said, which was not an answer. Christmas came and went. The Fairfax Ranch exchanged gifts with a formality that Georgia found achingly hollow. Harlan gave Clement a new rifle. Margaret gave Georgia a set of household linens. Clement gave Georgia a small cameo brooch, selected, she suspected, by his mother. Georgia gave Clement a set of books on cattle management that she had ordered from Dallas, which was practical and gracious and entirely adequate and meant nothing. On Christmas Eve, before the family gathered, Georgia went to her trunk and took out her mother's wedding dress and held it against herself in front of the mirror, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, all the things she had been carefully not feeling for the past 7 months, and then she put it away and went downstairs and poured herself a small glass of brandy and stood on the porch in the cold and looked at the stars over the Texas plain. The stars in the Panhandle in December were extraordinary, the kind of sky that made you feel small and large simultaneously, connected to everything and accountable to it. She thought about Wallace Abbott, 7 miles away in his house that she had never seen, and she wondered if he was looking at the same sky. Bess left in January. She cried at the stagecoach and held Georgia's hands and said, "Write me immediately if anything changes," and Georgia said, "Nothing is going to change," and they both knew she was wrong. February brought rain, which was rare and welcome, and with the rain came a conversation that changed everything. Georgia overheard it by accident. She was in the library, which was a room nobody used except herself, reaching for a volume from the high shelf when she heard Clement and Harlan in the adjoining room through the slightly open connecting door. They were not arguing exactly. They were discussing. "The Abbott land along the creek," Harlan was saying. "I've been thinking about it again." "He won't sell," Clement said. "I've approached him twice." "There are other ways to motivate a man to sell," Harlan said, and his voice had the comfortable tone of a man discussing ranch management rather than another man's livelihood. "Such as," Clement said. "His cattle," Harlan said. "There's a man in Amarillo who runs a very particular kind of bad luck for stubborn sellers. It doesn't have to be catastrophic, just enough to remind a man that holding out is expensive." Georgia stood absolutely still. "That's a risk," Clement said. "Everything worth having is a risk," Harlan said. "The land is worth it. That water source would double the value of the east pasture. "I'll think about it," Clement said. Georgia heard the sound of chairs, and she retreated carefully to the far side of the library, her heart hammering, and she stood behind a bookshelf, and she thought about what she had just heard with the precision of someone assembling a piece of evidence. She thought about Wallace Abbott's father, who had accepted a bad deal 25 years ago because Harlan Fairfax had held all the cards. She thought about bad luck being arranged for cattle. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years rebuilding his herd after the winter of '78, acre by acre and head by head, with the patient determination of someone who believed in the justness of honest work. She thought about what it would do to him if he lost that herd. She did not go to the creek that afternoon. She went into town, telling Consuela she needed thread, and at the general store she sent a message through Mrs. Prentice, the storekeeper's wife, who ran the informal communication network of Redemption Creek with the quiet efficiency of a telegraph operator. She said only, "I need to speak with you. The matter is urgent." By the next morning, Wallace Abbott was at the front door of the Fairfax ranch, hat in hand, asking to speak with Mrs. Fairfax on a matter of a property boundary question. It was a plausible reason. Clement had gone to town. Harlan was in the south pasture. Georgia took him into the sitting room and she told him, quietly and completely, exactly what she had heard, without interpretation and without drama. Wallace listened. His face was very still. "How certain are you of what you heard?" he asked when she was done. "I know the difference between gossip and a specific plan," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the floor, then at her. "Why are you telling me this?" She held his gaze. "Because what they're planning is wrong," she said. "Because your father deserved better and you deserve better, and because watching the same family do the same thing twice when you could have stopped it would be something I could not live with." He looked at her for a long, long moment, and in his expression was something so undisguised that she had to look slightly to the side of it to bear it. "Georgia," he said. "Don't," she said softly. "I know," he said. He left within the quarter hour, and Georgia sat in the sitting room for a long time after, and she realized that she had stopped pretending, at least to herself sometime in the last several months, and that the truth of what she felt was heavy and bright and impossible, like a lamp burning in a room with no door. Wallace Abbott was not an idle man and was not an unprotected one. He rode to Amarillo the following week and spoke with the county sheriff and the cattle association, laying out what he knew clearly and without exaggeration, and he came back with a level of official attention pointed in the direction of whatever man Harlan Fairfax might hire from Amarillo that made the plan effectively impossible. He had done this quietly and legally and thoroughly, and the Fairfaxes never knew who had heard what. But Clement, who was more perceptive than he seemed, noticed something. He noticed it in Georgia, in some indefinable shift in the way she moved through the ranch house, not unhappier exactly but more present in herself, more certain, as though she had made some decision that she was not announcing. In March, Clement came to Georgia's room. They had not shared a room since the first month of their marriage, which she had been too grateful for to examine closely, and he sat in the chair by the window and looked at her with those calculating eyes and said, "You are not happy." "No," she said. "You haven't been happy since you arrived," he said. "No," she said again. "Was it ever possible that you would be?" He asked, and the question was genuinely curious rather than unkind, which told her everything about the nature of the problem. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think it might have been if things had been different." He nodded slowly. "Clara Bellamy has asked me to come to Fort Worth," he said. "She's going back in the spring." Georgia was very quiet. "I don't think I'm going to say no," he said. She looked at her hands. "I could not be what you needed," Clement said, with a kind of detached honesty that was the most real thing he had ever said to her. "And you could not be what I was looking for. I think we both knew it." "Your father will not be pleased," Georgia said. "My father never owned my life," Clement said. Despite his best efforts, he paused. "I have spoken to Reverend Marsh about an annulment. The grounds are thin but not impossible. It has been 9 months and there are no children, and there is the matter of certain misrepresentations in the original correspondence." He looked at her carefully. "I told you the ranch was fully solvent in my letters. It was not at the time." Georgia absorbed this. "The annulment would leave you with a modest settlement," Clement said. "Not substantial, but sufficient to see you comfortable for a time, and it would leave you free." She thought about the word free with the same reverence she might give to the word water in a dry year. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Clement was quiet for a moment. "Because I am not entirely without conscience," he said, "and because Clara Bellamy would not wait indefinitely." He almost smiled. "And because there is a man in this county who looks at my wife with an expression that makes me feel, for the first time in my life, that I have failed to appreciate what I had." Georgia looked at him. "I'm not jealous," Clement clarified. "That's the interesting thing. I think I'm just honest enough to recognize what he sees." He stood, brushing his trousers. "I'll see to the legal matters. It will take several weeks." He left the room. Georgia sat in the chair he had vacated and looked out the window at the Texas plain under its March sky, pale gold and wide, and she felt something enormous and terrifying and necessary move through her. The next 6 weeks were strange ones. Clement remained in the house but was frequently away. Harlan was cold to Georgia and warmer to Clement, which reversed two dynamics simultaneously. Margaret Fairfax said very little to anyone. The household moved through its routines with the careful delicacy of a structure that knows it is being dismantled. Georgia wrote to Bess. Not about the annulment, not yet, but about Wallace, honestly and for the first time. She wrote about the creek and the fence line and the Christmas stars and what she had heard in the library, and she wrote about the way he listened, and the way he said her name, and the way she had been the most alive in the last year when she was in the radius of him. She sent the letter and then felt slightly terrified and then received back from Bess a letter that said, in its entirety, "I knew at the moment you said you went to the wrong church. Come home." Georgia wrote back, "It is not that simple." Bess wrote back, "It never is. But darling, you deserve the dress and the right altar. Go find it." The annulment was finalized in early May. Reverend Marsh handled the paperwork with the discretion of a man who understood that small towns required careful navigation, and the whole matter was conducted quietly and registered officially. And on the 3rd of May, 1883, Georgia Aldridge, not Georgia Fairfax, Georgia Aldridge again, by her own insistence, by her own name, her father's name, walked out of the Fairfax ranch with her trunk and her mother's dress and her father's pocket watch, and the settlement that Clement had promised, which was modest but real. And Consuela cried a little and pressed a baked good into her hand that Georgia ate on the stagecoach ride into town, and found she could taste properly for the first time in months. She took a room at the boarding house on the east side of Redemption Creek, run by a widow named Mrs. Hannigan, who was Irish and sharp and entirely non-judgmental, and who had apparently heard enough about Georgia's situation. This was a small town, after all, to make up the nicest room in the house and say only, "Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6, and I don't stand for nonsense from gentlemen callers, of which I suspect you'll have one very shortly." Georgia set down her trunk in the nicest room in the boarding house and sat on the edge of the bed and thought, now what? She was 24 years old and technically free and genuinely uncertain, which was terrifying, and also, she discovered slowly over the following days, somewhat exhilarating. She did not go to the creek. She thought about this decision actively and then let it alone. She had been married to Clement Fairfax for 11 months and was now the subject of an annulment, and whatever she felt about Wallace Abbott needed to breathe some free air before she pointed it in any direction, because she was done making decisions out of desperation. This one, if there was one to make, she would make out of something stronger. She found work immediately, because Georgia Aldridge was not the kind of woman who sat still. Mrs. Prentice at the general store needed help with the accounts, and it turned out that Georgia's bookkeeping skills, which had gone to waste on the Fairfax ranch's already adequate systems, were genuinely valuable in a store where the accounting had been done on optimism and scraps of brown paper. She started 3 days a week, and within a fortnight it was every day. She wrote to Bess with better news. "I have work and I have my own room and I have an excellent breakfast every morning." Bess wrote back, "And the cowboy?" Georgia replied, "Give me time." She saw Wallace in town on the second Saturday of May. He was at the livery stable when she walked past on her way back from the store, talking with the farrier about a horse's shoe. He saw her and went still, and then he walked toward her with the deliberate, measured pace that was distinctively his, and he stopped a proper distance away and touched his hat and said, "Mrs. Fairfax." "Miss Aldridge," she corrected, and watched his face go through something. "I heard," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said, echoing his own words back to him from that first day on the steps of the Baptist church, and she watched him recognize them, and something in the line of his mouth softened. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Better than I've been," she said honestly. "Good," he said, and then very carefully, as though selecting each word individually, "I've been thinking about saying something to you for most of a year. I've been deciding that I shouldn't say it for most of a year." "That's a long time to decide not to say something," Georgia observed. "You were married," he said simply. "Yes," she said, "I was." The word hung between them in the May sunshine, past tense and exact. "Georgia," he said, and she heard in her name in his mouth, the same thing she had heard the first time, something worth saying carefully. "I know the timing is, I know you've just come through something difficult and I'm not asking anything right now. I just want you to know that he started again. "I want to go on saying hello to you in town forever," he said. "I want the chance to do more than that if you're willing, that's all I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. The town moved around them, a horse clipping past, a child running on the boardwalk, the sound of the farrier's hammer from the stable. "I'm not ready today," she said. "I know," he said. "But I'm not saying no," she said. "I'm saying give me time to be just myself for a while." "I've got plenty of time," he said, and said it with such simple honesty that she felt it land somewhere central and warm and real. "Then we're agreed," she said. "We are," he said, and he touched his hat again and went back to the livery stable, and Georgia walked the rest of the way back to Mrs. Hannigan's boarding house with her head up and her step lighter than it had any reason to be. The summer of 1883 was the summer Georgia Aldridge remade herself. She worked at the general store 5 days a week, and kept the books with a thoroughness that delighted Mrs. Prentice and mildly alarmed Mr. Prentice, when he realized how much money had been leaking from the accounts for years. She took up riding again for pleasure. She had borrowed copper from the Fairfax stable as part of the settlement, and Mrs. Hannigan had a paddock. And she rode out on the open land in the early evenings, and felt the dust and the heat and the wind and the scale of the Texas sky do something restorative to her. She and Wallace existed, for 3 months, in a careful and pleasant and quietly building friendship. He came into the store twice a week to buy supplies for the ranch, and they talked, properly talked, about everything from his expansion plans to her father's hardware store, to whether the new railroad line being discussed would reach Redemption Creek before the end of the decade. They talked about books and weather, and the unjust things the world did to ordinary people, and the stubborn persistence required to live well in spite of it. He was funny. This surprised her, or rather it did not surprise her, but it delighted her, a dry, understated humor that crept up on her and left her laughing when she had not expected to. He had opinions about everything but held them lightly, in the way of someone who has learned that certainty costs more than it's worth. He listened to her with the same quality of attention she had noticed the first day, and which had not diminished on further acquaintance. In July he asked her to dinner. He did it the proper way, called at Mrs. Hannigan's house in the early evening, hat in hand, and asked Mrs. Hannigan first if she might permit her guest to accompany him to the hotel dining room for supper. And Mrs. Hannigan had said yes with the brisk approval of a woman who has been waiting for this development for 8 weeks. The hotel dining room in Redemption Creek was not Paris, but it had clean tablecloths and candles and a cook who did something remarkable with game hen, and Wallace sat across from Georgia in his best shirt, not a suit, but a clean dark shirt with the sleeves rolled down and a string tie that he had clearly invested some effort in. And she was wearing her blue dress, which was her favorite. And they ate and talked and laughed, and when he walked her back to the boarding house in the warm July night, he stopped at the gate and said, "Georgia, I have been in danger of being completely lost on this subject for over a year." "The subject," she said. "You," he said, with the simplicity of a man who has been through too much honesty to resort to anything else. She looked up at him in the summer dark, and the stars were enormous overhead, and Main Street was quiet around them, and she thought about every moment of the past 14 months. The wrong church and the right dress and his hand on her arm walking down the street and the creek in August and the Christmas stars and the library and the annulment and the months of being patient and careful and just. She reached up and touched his jaw, the jaw with the old thin scar, and felt him go still under her hand. "Wallace Abbott," she said, "I have been in the same danger." He covered her hand with his large, warm, calloused from rope and fence wire and honest work, and held it against his cheek, and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that were used to seeing at a distance and had apparently been seeing her clearly for a very long time. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Later they would disagree amiably about who kissed whom, and the disagreement itself was one of the things Georgia would love most about the years that followed. It was slow and real and tasted like everything that had been held at bay for too long, and when they pulled back the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Hello," he said softly, which was ridiculous and perfect. "Hello," she said. Mrs. Hannigan, watching from the window, had the grace to move away before they looked up. The months that followed were the months Georgia kept coming back to for the rest of her life, not as the most dramatic or the most momentous, but as the most purely good. They rode together in the evenings on the open land, and he showed her his property, the 60 acres along the creek, the newer land he had bought, the cattle moving slow and substantial across the grass. He showed her the house his father had built, which was plain but solid, and which smelled of cedar and coffee and old wood. She showed him her mother's wedding dress one afternoon when he came to the boarding house for tea, unfolding it from the trunk and holding it up in the afternoon light, and he looked at it the way men look at things that contain more meaning than objects usually carry. "It's extraordinary," he said. "My mother made every stitch," Georgia said. "She must have been remarkable," he said. "She was," Georgia said. "She would have liked you." He looked at her steadily. "Would she?" "She liked honest men," Georgia said. "She didn't have much patience for anything else." "Then I will endeavor to live up to her standards," he said, and Georgia felt something close and warm and immovable settle in her chest. October came with golden light and cool mornings, and on a Sunday after church services, he had begun attending regularly, which Reverend Marsh observed with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose congregation was growing. Wallace asked if she would walk with him out to the creek. They walked out in the October afternoon, the land turning amber around them, the cottonwood trees dropping their last yellow leaves onto the clear water, and Wallace stopped at the exact spot where they had stood the previous August, the first time she had ridden out there alone and found him. He turned to face her. He had no hat in his hands, which was unusual. He had clearly made a decision about his hands and put them at his sides, and this visible deliberateness made her heart do something irregular. "Georgia," he said. "Yes," she said, before he got any further, because she had known this was coming and she wanted him to know she was already at yes. He blinked. "I haven't asked anything yet." "I know," she said. "You're certain you know what I'm going to ask," he said. "Wallace Abbott," she said, "you brought me to this exact spot on purpose. You have been working up to something for the past 3 weeks that I have watched very clearly. You have been looking at me in church like you are making a decision about something important. You have no hat to turn in your hands and you've been standing very still, which means you are nervous, and you are not generally a nervous man." He looked at her. A smile was happening slowly. "You are the most observant person I have ever met." "Well," she said. He laughed low and real and reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring. It was not elaborate and it was not expensive, and it was clearly chosen with great care. A thin gold band with a small garnet stone that caught the October light and glowed like something alive. "I found the garnet in the creek," he said. "About a year ago, before I knew what it was for. Had it set by the jeweler in Amarillo last month." He looked at it and then at her. "Georgia Aldridge, I would like very much to be your husband if you will have me, not for practical reasons, not because it's sensible. Because you are the clearest, most honest, most full-of-life person I've encountered in 28 years, and because I would like to spend the rest of my years listening to you think out loud. Because you walked into the wrong church in the right dress, and I sat in the back of someone else's wedding with a stone in my chest, knowing I was about to watch you walk back out and go marry a man who didn't deserve to be in the same county as you." Georgia was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. "That's the most words I have ever heard you say at once," she said, which was true and also a way of managing the crying situation. "I've been saving them up," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, that's what I've been doing." Or, "Yes, Wallace," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He looked at her with something in his face so purely good that it made the tears non-negotiable after all, which she discovered when one of them ran down her cheek without permission. He stepped toward her and she stepped toward him, and he put the ring on her finger and then took her face in both of his hands, very gently, and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and the creek ran over its red stones, and the cottonwoods dropped their gold, and the Texas sky was the particular shade of October blue that looked like a promise. They were married in December 1883. They were married in the Methodist Church. Georgia had a word with Reverend Marsh well in advance about which church she was walking into, and she checked twice, and the building was full. Mrs. Hannigan was there in her good green dress. Mrs. Prentice and Mr. Prentice sat together. Consuela had driven in from the Fairfax ranch without being asked and sat in the third row with her Sunday shawl and looked fierce with satisfaction. Several of Wallace's neighbors were there, men who respected him and had come to show it. Bess was there. Bess had come all the way from Galveston on the train and had spent the night before at the boarding house and had stayed up past midnight with Georgia, talking in the way sisters talk when they have not had enough time together. And in the morning she had helped Georgia into their mother's dress again and stepped back and pressed both hands over her mouth and said, "Oh, Georgia, oh." "Is it all right?" Georgia asked. "It's everything," said Bess. "You look like her." Georgia pressed her hands against the ivory silk and breathed. "She would have been so happy," Bess said. "I know," said Georgia. "I think she knows anyway." Walking into the Methodist church in her mother's dress, on the arm of her friend Mrs. Hannigan, who had agreed to walk her in, Georgia Aldridge looked down the aisle and saw Wallace at the altar. He was in a proper suit, dark, well-fitted, clearly his own this time and not borrowed, and his hair was cut, finally, and he was standing with the absolute stillness of a man who is not nervous at all, who has been entirely certain of this for a very long time, and is finally at the place certainty had been pointing him toward. He saw her and his whole face changed. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of stories, but in the way real things change, the way a field changes when the sun goes behind a cloud and then comes back. She walked toward him. Reverend Marsh, who had now married Georgia twice, looked at his Bible with the expression of a man who found this situation deeply satisfying and was trying to maintain professional dignity about it. They said their vows. Georgia's voice was steady. Wallace's voice was low and clear, and when he said "I will," it sounded like the most fundamental and uncomplicated truth she had ever heard spoken aloud. He put a ring on her finger, a plain gold band to match the garnet engagement ring, and she put one on his, and Reverend Marsh said the words, and Wallace Abbott kissed his wife with a warmth and decisiveness that made Mrs. Hannigan lead the applause. The reception was in the large room at the back of the hotel, because neither of them had a ranch house prepared yet. They had agreed to spend the first weeks at the Abbott property, and then spend the winter planning the improvements they wanted to make. There was dancing, because Bess had organized dancing with the cheerful ruthlessness of a woman who knew what a party needed. And there was Mrs. Prentice's apple cake, and there was whiskey, and there was fiddle music that ran out into the December night and down the main street of Redemption Creek and seemed to make the whole cold dark friendlier. Wallace danced with Georgia for 3 songs and then said, "I should tell you that I cannot dance," which was something she had already independently determined. "You're managing," she said. "I am moving in a pattern that broadly corresponds to the music," he said. "That is not dancing." "It is the dancing of a man who is doing his best," she said, "and that is the kind I like best." He pulled her a little closer and stopped trying to match the fiddle and just moved with her, slow and warm, and she put her head against his chest and felt his arms tighten around her and thought, This is the thing I was keeping myself for, when I didn't have the words for it yet." Bess, passing with a glass of punch, gave Georgia a look of such complete and unguarded happiness that Georgia felt a second-tier escape, which was becoming a habit. They went home to the Abbott ranch that night, through the cold December dark, Wallace driving the wagon and Georgia sitting beside him with a wool blanket over both of them, and the stars burning overhead in that enormous Texas sky. The house was warm. Wallace had stoked the fire before they left for the church, and there were candles on the table which he had placed there that morning, and Georgia walked through the front door of her husband's house, and stood in the middle of it and felt it fit around her. "Well," she said. "Well," he said behind her, smiling with his whole face. "It needs some things," she said, looking around at the walls and the furniture and the bare windows. "It does," he agreed. "I have opinions," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been looking forward to your opinions about this house for months." She turned to face him in the candlelight. He was looking at her with such unguarded and absolute affection that she felt it from across the room like warmth from a fire. "Wallace Abbott," she said, "I walked into the wrong church in May of 1882. "You did," he said. "And you stood up before the preacher could finish," she said. "I couldn't let you go back out without somebody pointing you in the right direction," he said. "You did more than that," she said. "I tried," he said simply. She crossed the room and took his face in her hands, the way she had that first evening at the boarding house gate, and she kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the candles burned, and outside the December wind moved across the Texas plain in the cold and the dark and the extraordinary starlight, and the house was warm. The years that came after were full and real and not without difficulty, because good lives never are. There were dry summers and cold winters, and the perpetual anxiety of weather-dependent work. There was a dispute with a neighboring property that took 2 years and a lawyer from Amarillo to resolve. There were months when the cattle prices dropped, and the math of the ranch was tight, and Georgia spent long evenings at the kitchen table, going over the accounts, with the focused precision of someone who has learned that thoroughness is a form of love. But there was also the spring of 1885, when the creek ran high and the wildflowers came in abundance, and Georgia sat on the porch steps with her hand on her belly and told Wallace, who was coming back from the east pasture, that they were going to need to add a room. He stopped at the gate, looked at her hand. "Georgia," he said, which was all he said, but it was everything. "August, I think," she said. He came through the gate and up the steps and sat down beside her on the steps without any transition and took her hand and looked at it for a long moment and said, "A room." "Unless you'd like the child to sleep in the barn," Georgia said. "No," he said, "definitely a room." He was quiet for a moment. "A good one." "The best one," she said. Their son was born in August of 1885, as Georgia had predicted, with the reliable conviction of a man who was not going to miss his own arrival. They named him Thomas, for George's father, and he came into the world with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's stubborn set to his jaw, and he was entirely himself from the first moment, which Georgia had been told was how it worked but had not quite believed until she held him. Wallace held his son with the careful intensity of someone handling something irreplaceable, and looked at Georgia over the baby's head with an expression she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. "Hello, Thomas," Wallace said, very quietly. which was the best greeting Thomas Aldridge Abbott would receive in his long and eventual life, because first greetings from honest men carry a particular weight. Bess came to see her nephew in September. Having married in June, the young man who had appeared in 3 separate letters had materialized as a perfectly acceptable schoolteacher named Peter Donahue, and the wedding in Galveston had been small and joyful and entirely chosen. Bess arrived at the Abbott Ranch with Peter, and with the particular glow of a woman who has her life going right, and she held Thomas for 2 hours and argued gently with Georgia about baby names the whole time, and Georgia loved her fiercely. Thomas learned to walk with the aggressive enthusiasm of a child who has a large stretch of Texas to cover, and he did it early, and after that he was everywhere, all the time, in the way of first children who do not yet understand that there are limits. Wallace taught him to ride at 3 years old, a small brown pony of absolute patience, and Georgia watched from the fence rail with her arms folded and her heart in her throat, and Thomas had no fear at all, which was both wonderful and entirely exhausting. In 1887, Georgia and Wallace added the room they had been planning, and the room was for a daughter named Alina, called Ellie from the first week, who had red gold hair that no one on either side of the family could account for, and who was from the beginning a different kind of creature from her brother, slower to noise and quicker to observation, sitting in corners watching everything with a seriousness that made Reverend Marsh, at her baptism, observe that she appeared to be taking notes. "She is," Georgia confirmed. Wallace looked at Alina with the same careful wonder he had given Thomas, and Alina looked back at him with the disconcerting directness of an 8-pound person who has already made assessments. Georgia thought, watching them, that her mother would have loved this man, and that her father would have shaken his hand and said very little and meant everything. By 1889, the Abbott Ranch was one of the better-run operations in the county. Wallace had expanded the herd to 400 head, and his cattle were known in Amarillo for their quality, and the ranch had a small permanent crew of 3 men who had worked with Wallace since the early days, and a younger man named Cortez who had come up from the south, and who had a gift with horses that Wallace said was the finest he had encountered in 30 years. Georgia ran the accounts and corresponded with the cattle broker in Abilene, and managed the household, and kept a kitchen garden of impractical ambition that provided most of their vegetables and all of her joy from April through October. Harlan Fairfax died in 1888, which was a fact. Margaret moved to Dallas to live with a cousin. Clement had indeed gone to Fort Worth with Clara Bellamy, and whatever had become of that arrangement was not something Redemption Creek knew in detail, only that he had not come back. The Fairfax Ranch was sold in parcels to 3 different buyers, and the land that had once loomed over the whole county was divided up and absorbed into the ordinary life of the place, and eventually people stopped talking about it. Georgia thought about Clement sometimes, not with bitterness and not with regret, but with the complicated feeling of someone who has survived a thing they were not sure they would. She thought he had been, in his own unsatisfying way, honest about what he was and what he wanted, and that his letting her go had been the most generous thing he had done for anyone, perhaps including himself. She hoped he was well. She did not think about him often. She thought about her father often, and her mother always. On the mantelpiece of the Abbott Ranch house there was a photograph, taken by a traveling photographer in 1886, Georgia and Wallace sitting on the porch steps, Thomas standing between them with both his parents' hands, and in the background the flat Texas land running out to the horizon in the particular way it does, as though the world has decided to give you as much sky as you can hold. They were looking at the photographer with the comfortable expressions of people who know what they have. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the work was done and the house was quiet, Georgia and Wallace sat on the porch in the warm months or by the fire in the cold ones, and they talked or they were silent, both of which were forms of the same conversation, and the land around them was wide and real and theirs, and the creek ran a 1/4 mile away over its red stones in the dark, the same creek it had always been, which had begun the whole thing. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Georgia said, one October evening in 1889, sitting on the porch with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the last light leave the sky. "I have a reasonable idea," Wallace said beside her, his boots on the rail, a cup of coffee balanced on his knee. "The Baptist church," she said. He smiled. It was fully dark by now, and she felt more than saw the smile. "What about it?" he said. "I walked in there so certain I knew where I was," she said. "And I was entirely wrong about every single thing. The church, the groom, the life I was walking toward." She paused. "And it was the best mistake I ever made." "For what it's worth," Wallace said, "when you walked through that door in that dress in the middle of someone else's wedding, I thought, 'There is the most remarkable woman I have ever seen.'" "You thought that," she said. "And then I thought, 'That is a woman who is about to walk out of here and marry the wrong man,'" he said. "And I stood up, and I do not know precisely what I intended to do, but I knew I could not sit there and watch you leave without doing something." "You showed me the way to the right building," she said. "I showed you the wrong building," he said. "You figured out the right one yourself." She turned to look at him in the dark. "That," she said, "is the most Wallace Abbott thing you have ever said." He laughed, and the laugh went out into the October night, and the stars received it, and the land received it, and the creek in the dark received it. And Georgia Aldridge Abbott, 29 years old and exactly where she was supposed to be, leaned her head onto her husband's shoulder and felt the immense, specific, particular goodness of a life that had been found rather than planned. Thomas called out from inside the house, some minor nighttime complaint about a boot he had left somewhere, and Wallace set down his coffee and stood without hurrying and went in, and Georgia heard his voice inside talking to their son with that same low, unhurried calm that had steadied her on the steps of the Baptist church 7 years ago, and she pressed her hand briefly against her collarbone, a gesture she had made on that day, and apparently was never going to stop making. And she looked at the Texas stars and thought, there it is, not the life she had planned in Galveston, with the hardware store and the grief and the desperate practicality. Not the life she had been given at the Fairfax Ranch, which was comfortable and hollow and cold. This one. The one with the red garnet ring and the messy kitchen garden, and the children with their mix of both of them, and the man who turned his hat in his hands when he was thinking, and who had once stood up in the back of a wedding to make sure a woman in the wrong church found her way. She was found. She was home. She was Georgia Aldridge Abbott of Redemption Creek, Texas, and the right dress had always known where it was going, even when she hadn't. By 1890, the small town of Redemption Creek had grown enough to require a second schoolteacher, and Georgia, who had been tutoring Thomas at home and had opinions about education that could fill a room, took the position without being asked twice. She taught arithmetic and reading, and the kind of clear-eyed honesty about the world that she had learned from her father and from her mother, and from the particular education of her own life. Her students were a mixed collection: ranch children, town children, a few children from the Mexican families who had lived and worked in the county longer than most of the white settlers and who faced, Georgia recognized, an injustice as old as the land itself. She taught all of them with the same attention, and when other voices in town suggested that the Mexican children might be better served in a separate arrangement, Georgia said, very calmly and very finally, that she disagreed, and that she would continue teaching whoever appeared in her schoolroom, and that if this was a problem, someone was welcome to take it up with the school board, who they would find to be populated by people whose accounts she maintained and whose goodwill she had, and the matter was not raised again. Wallace had watched this sequence of events with the expression of a man who has always known exactly who he married and is regularly reminded of it in the best possible way. "You are formidable," he said that evening. "I am practical," she said. "Both," he said. "Don't argue with me," she said. "Never," he said, meaning always, which was one of the great ongoing pleasures of their life together. Thomas, at 5, had developed the social confidence of someone who had never been told he was less than interesting, and had taken this as confirmed fact. He narrated the world continuously and had opinions about horses that he expressed at length to anyone stationary enough to be addressed. Ellie, at 3, watched everything and said little and had recently begun drawing pictures of the ranch on any flat surface she could find, including once, memorably, the back of a letter Georgia had been writing to Bess. Bess came every year. She and Peter had 2 children of their own now, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Rose. And the Donahue children and the Abbott children ran the ranch in August with a collective energy that made the horses nervous and made Georgia and Bess sit on the porch laughing in the evenings in the way that they had not laughed since their father's house, and which was, both of them understood, the best sound in their respective worlds. Georgia wrote Bess a letter every week, and Bess wrote back with the same frequency. And the letters that traveled between Galveston and Redemption Creek in the years that followed contained everything that mattered about the shape of 2 sisters' lives. The funny things and the hard things and the small daily details that were, as Georgia had come to understand, the actual substance of a life. The things that looked like incidentals but were in fact the whole of it. She was 41 when Thomas married a girl from Amarillo named Clara, a different Clara entirely. A rancher's daughter with a quick mind and a quick temper, and a laugh that arrived like sudden weather. And she stood in the Methodist Church of Redemption Creek, which she now knew from every angle, and watched her son put a ring on someone's finger, and reached without looking for Wallace's hand, and found it there. She was 53 when Wallace taught their grandchildren to ride, just as he had taught Thomas and Ellie, just as his own father had taught him. The same patience and the same brown pony. A different brown pony, the original having died at a thoroughly excellent age, and the circle of it completed something in her that had been waiting to be completed. She kept her mother's dress in the cedar trunk until Ellie asked about it on a winter evening when she was 17, and Georgia took it out and unfolded it in the lamplight of the bedroom. And Ellie touched the hand-tatted lace with the delicate attention of someone who understands the nature of relics. "You wore this," Ellie said. "Your grandmother made every stitch," Georgia said. "It's beautiful," Ellie said. "When you're ready for it," Georgia said, "it's yours." Ellie looked at her mother. "Did you know when you walked into that church that you were about to change everything?" Georgia thought about the May morning in 1882, the wrong door, the turned heads, the silence, the man standing up in the back with his hat in his hands and that particular quality of attention. "No," she said. "I thought I was heading straight for the life I'd decided to accept." "Instead," Ellie said. Georgia smiled. "Instead your father stood up," she said. She folded the dress back into the cedar trunk. And outside the winter wind moved across the Texas plain the way it always had and always would. And inside the house was warm and smelled of cedar and coffee and old wood, and the accumulated ordinary, extraordinary, specific life of Wallace and Georgia Abbott, who had found each other at the wrong altar on a May morning in 1882, and had never once, in all the years that followed, been lost.